He was very coordinated. And so when he went to visit the Black Canyon Reservoir, he wanted to take a look at the Black Canyon and all of its beauty. And so he saw it from the railing, but he climbed over. He wanted to look down, see the majesty of the depths. He felt like he was in total control until his foot slipped. And he fell. He didn't fall all the way, but he did fall to a ledge below where his body was just shattered or broken. And it took professionals to get him out of there. And suddenly he was in the hospital, his body all broken to pieces. Still alive, but no longer the man that he once was. Part of him was paralyzed. Just like that, he fell. As we look at the Old Testament, we see Adam and Eve created in such a marvelous way. And we marvel at all those firsts that are there. The creation of all the universe. The creation of Adam. And then the creation of Eve. I remember as a teenager sitting in church with my first girlfriend. She had my Bible, and she was underlining something in my Bible. And then she handed it back to me, and the verse that she'd underlined was, "It is not good for man to be alone." And it certainly isn't. And that's why I'm so thankful that God gave me Jody as my wife. It is good. All is good that he created. Everything is so good. The fellowship with God was so good. But then came the fall. And Adam and Eve sinned. And when they fell, everything was messed up. Still in the image of God, but now a shattered image. And it affected their relationship with each other, Adam and Eve. Affected their relationship with God. And Eve had consequences, and all womankind after that. Man had consequences. There was a curse upon the land. They were driven out of the Garden of Eden. And there, angels were placed with flaming swords to never let them back in. Something I think probably persisted until the flood. That was the consequences of the fall. You've got this terrible flood that comes down. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Talks about God looking over the land and seeing mankind, and he's seeing that everyone is totally wicked, and all the intents and the imaginations of their heart are totally, totally evil. He determines to bring a flood. So that flood brings destruction and judgment upon everyone, but he provides a plan, and that plan is the ark. So a remnant survives. We don't know how long it was until after that, but they started to populate the earth again. But instead of filling the earth and subduing and going everywhere, they gathered together in one location. And still being in the image of God with their intellect, they started creating wonderful things and using it all to do their mission. They started building that tower, a tower to heaven, and God saw that they weren't obeying him. And so he messed up all of their languages and scattered them among the earth. Yeah, that's the sin that man had. Cain kills Abel. People are evil. Flood. Tower of Babel. Can anything good come out of this mess? After the fall, is mankind permanently broken up? Messed up? No good future? Well, after we get to this point in the story, we come to the start of God's plan. So we are going to look at the story of the Patriarchs today. And if you remember, there are 10 episodes involved here. And that is beginnings, Patriarchs, Exodus, settlement, Judges, United Kingdom, divided kingdom, captivity, restoration, and that period of silence where they wait for the coming Christ. So last week we looked at episode 1, the beginnings. And we looked at 4 main things. You see it on the screen. Can you say those with me? Creation, fall, flood, and Babel. Today we're going to study the rest of the book of Genesis. And we're going to look at this episode starting in Genesis chapter 12 onward, called the Patriarchs. You wonder how these two halves fit together? Here's a short video that explains it.
We're walking through the book of Genesis, which is made up of these two main parts.
And the first part begins in the garden, where we watch humanity spiral downward in self-destruction, and it ends in the Tower of Babel, where a rebellious humanity is scattered by God.
Then the second part of Genesis zooms in and focuses on just one family.
And right in the middle is this story that links the two parts of Genesis together and helps us understand what the whole book is all about.
So how do we get from the Tower of Babel to the story here in the middle?
Well, after the scattering at Babel, there's this genealogy, and it follows one of the tribes all the way down to this one guy named Abram.
You probably know him as Abraham.
And God starts making all these promises to Abraham, like he's going to bless him and give him a ton of kids. And he says that through him and his family, all the nations of the earth are now going to find God's blessing. So basically, God is trying to restore humanity back to the goodness of the garden and to his original intentions for the world. So it's like his rescue plan for humanity. And that's why the whole second half of Genesis is about this one family. And so you have Abraham, and then he has his son Isaac, who has Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons. And to each generation, God renews his promise to bless them and all nations through them.
So because of this promise to use this family to rescue the world, it's pretty easy to read these stories as examples of how to be a good person.
But actually, for the most part, this family is totally dysfunctional. So for example, let's go back to Abraham. This whole story is about God giving him and his wife Sarah a family, but two different times. He basically gives Sarah away to other men by denying that she's even his wife. And then Sarah gets impatient about having a son, and so she makes Abraham sleep with her servant girl, which then causes all of these other problems in the family.
So they get really old, and you begin to think that there's no way they're going to have a kid of their own. But then, miraculously, they do. It's Isaac.
And Isaac, he has two sons, Esau and Jacob, and it seems like things are going pretty good.
But Jacob, the younger brother, wants the family's inheritance, which belongs to Esau, the older brother. So he devises a plan where he's going to steal it from his father, Isaac, who at this point in the story is now old and blind.
Which, who does that? Horrible, stealing from your blind father.
Yeah, and then he just takes off.
So Jacob goes on from there to have 12 sons, big family. But Jacob loves his 11th son, Joseph, way more than all the others. And so he gives him the special Technicolor dream coat. And his brothers, because of this, come to hate him.
So much so that they plan on killing him.
But they don't. They instead just sell him as a slave down in Egypt.
Now, while in Egypt, through this crazy series of events, Joseph goes from being in a prison cell to becoming the second in command there.
And so later on, the whole Middle East falls into this food shortage. And Joseph's brothers, they come down to Egypt looking for food. And then when they get there, who should they find as the ruler of the whole land?
It's Joseph, that guy they sold into slavery. But he actually saves them from starving to death.
And so here you have it. These are the great-grandchildren of Abraham who have done this heinous act to their brother. But God has transformed their evil into something good.
And that's exactly what Joseph says here in the last paragraph of the entire book. He says, you guys planned all of this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save people's lives.
Now, these words, they conclude the book because they actually summarize the message of the whole story so far. Humans keep choosing evil, and we are thinking they're screwing up God's plan, but he keeps turning their evil back into good. And somehow, he's going to use this family to restore humanity back to the garden.
So that's the book of Genesis. But we still don't know how exactly he's going to use this family to bring us back to the garden.
Well, yeah, but this is just the first book, so that's what the rest of the Bible sets out to answer.
So today we are looking at this second episode called Patriarchs. If you've been reading along in your notebooks before you came, you know that there are 4 key patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Can we say those together? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And the key theme that we're going to see through all of this is this. As God reveals his plan and promises, respond in faith and you will be blessed. Let me say that again. As God reveals his plan and promises, respond in faith and you will be greatly blessed. And the beauty about this whole thing is we have a God who has a plan. We as humans can totally mess things up, just like Adam and Eve did, just like his descendants did, just like you and I do. And we can reach that point where we have messed up our lives so very, very, very much, and we think nothing can be done to restore it. Due to Adam and Eve's fall and our own fall, we're so shattered, we say, what kind of future can I possibly have? But we've got a God that still loves you, and he's got a plan. And that's the beauty of the Old Testament. It leads us through that plan, and it culminates with the coming of Jesus Christ in the beginning of the New Testament. And so we are going to look at God's plan and our need to look at that rescue plan in faith in God. So let's get on a biblical timeline here. Abraham's date on this timeline is probably about 2000 BC. Let's go to that next slide. Can we do that? And he's the first of four great individuals that we've looked at. And so if we want to look at this, we can look at that circle there, and that's sort of where it all happened. And we could probably call that the navel of the earth. At least that's what historians call it. And because if you look at that area, that has almost been the center of so much attention all through the ages. How many of you have ever played the little game of Risk? Any of you played that? You played that one? I still play it on my little phone. I've got a phone app and I play that thing. It's just amazing to me how many times when I play that, the Middle East is so central in that game of Risk. Very, very fascinating. But it certainly has been central throughout all of history. And we constantly see that where time after time the world's great powers of the past have marched in conquest with Canaan and then called Palestine and then called Israel, being pulled and stretched by all this international and internal pressure. So that's sort of the area that we're looking at. And now we've got the story of Abraham. And it begins down in the Persian Gulf in an ancient city called Ur of Chaldees. And Abraham and his father, Terah, and his wife, Sarah, and his nephew, Lot, lived there and apparently became very, very prosperous there. And this is a critical land. And so let's look at that next slide. Can we do that? There's sort of a modern day map. And so you can sort of picture where it is today. And there's two great rivers there. There's the Tigris River that runs on down. There's the Euphrates. And let's look at the city of Baghdad. Can we click that one? So we all know where Baghdad is, so that's where that is today. How about Kuwait? Let's look at that. Do you remember when there was the Great War with the first President Bush, when he wanted to free Kuwait from Iran? And to the north is the location of ancient Babylon. Let's look there. And all of this, it still remains so critical today. And we've seen it with the Iraq War under the second Bush, and the freeing of Iraq or Kuwait under the first Bush. And it's still a great center of attention, all that is going on in that region. Well, they're down close to Kuwait area, a little bit north of that, is where the ancient city of Ur was. And there in Ur, we find Abraham and his family. Let's look at Abraham a little bit with another video.
Among the nations of the earth, God called out a man who is known to us as Abraham. God told Abraham to leave his home and go to the land he would show him. Abraham did as God said, taking all his people and possessions. God promised that Abraham would possess this land and become the father of a great nation. And through him, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. It was a peculiar promise, for Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children of their own. But Abraham obeyed God just the same and led his people to the land of Canaan.
Abraham's entrance into the story is pivotal. From what happens with Abraham, the sweep of human history, all is changed. And as you look at the Bible, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you find his story changes everything because he's chosen by God to be the father of many, many peoples, a people that would represent God to the entire world. And he's the father of the Hebrew people. He's also the father of believers in the New Testament. So we count Abraham as our father in a spiritual way as well, because all who put their faith in Jesus Christ, as Abraham put his faith in God, are truly children of Abraham, as they are children of God. Because of Adam's sin and his effect upon everybody, there needed to be a solution. And God started a plan, a rescue plan, a redemptive plan. And that all began with this man, Abraham. Abraham leads him to the land of Canaan eventually. He goes on up to Haran, and then he leads him to the land of Abraham, or to Canaan, and everything's going to change. Genesis chapter 12 is where God reveals this call. And as you look at that, he tells him to leave Ur and go to a land that will be shown to him in due time. I find this fascinating because he's operating in pure faith. You might have the idea that he's pulled out some ancient map and he says, all right, how do we get to Haran, which God says is next? But that's not what happens. God just sends him on out. He's on a journey that he doesn't know where it's going to end up. So he's just following God's directions as he goes. But before he leaves, God gives him this great Abrahamic covenant. You can call it a promise. You can call it a pledge. It's what we like to call the Abrahamic covenant. And let's go to the next slide if we can do that. And so in this pledge, God gives him three things. He gives him the law, he gives him three things. He gives him land, seed, and blessing. Now this promise that he gives him is unconditional in nature. This is something God is going to do. It's part of God's plan. And so in the coming days, we're going to see these people often sinning. But God still carries his plan forward. This is an unconditional covenantal promise. And so next slide is going to show us Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And I'm going to read this. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So let's look at those three parts of this particular promise. First is the promise of a land, and then a promise of a seed, and then a promise of a blessing. You can remember it by simply saying LSB. Can you say that with me? LSB. And that stands for land, seed, and blessing. So first of all, the first promise is a land. The Lord said to Abraham, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And so here we find real estate. It's this geographical inheritance that the Jewish people have revered ever since. And since that great day when they are able to return to the land and live there, they have marveled at the fact that they were able to return to their promised land. Promise number 2 is seed. And he says this in verse 2, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So he would have a long line of descendants. This is an incredible promise because at the point that it's given, he doesn't have any children whatsoever. It's still Abram and Sarai, and they've got this promise, and they're approaching old age, and they have never had any children. But they take that promise and they believe it anyway. Promise number 3, Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So this is a blessing that would be upon his descendants, but more than that, it would be a blessing that would bless everybody, especially those of us part of the family of God. We have been blessed way back with Abraham. That blessing was pointed in reserve for all of us ever since. So first of all, we need to recognize that this promise, if we're going to go to the next slide, is literal, it is eternal, and it is unconditional. So here he receives this promise, and he receives it back in Ur, and then he leaves it to follow God's direction. And so they leave totally in faith, not knowing where they're going to go. Can you imagine them? Let's go to the next slide, please. And the next slide after that. All right, keep clicking on that. Thank you. All right, let's keep going there. All right, and next slide. I'm sorry, I'm going a little fast for you, ain't I? All right. So they leave and they go up to Haran. Now, where's Haran? Well, if you were to go and look at a map right now, you'd find it's in modern Turkey. And while they are there, they become even more prosperous, and that's where Terah dies. But once again, God speaks to him, and he says, this time I want you to leave Haran and move onward towards the land that I'm going to show you. So he starts moving on. And where does he end up? Well, he ends up down in Canaan, which would eventually become Israel. And while he is there, God continues to bless him with this promise. But not children yet. When he gets to Canaan, he's like 75 years old. And his wife is 65 years old. And you say, God, are you just teasing him? Are you just sort of playing with his mind? You keep giving this promise, and yet you're not fulfilling it? Well, God continues to reinforce this promise. And so now while they're in the Canaan, God takes Abraham out on a beautiful starry evening. And he says this in Genesis chapter 15, verses 5 and 6. Look up at the heavens. Count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said, so shall your offspring be. Then catch this next sentence. Abraham believed the Lord, and he, God, credited it to him, Abraham, as righteousness. It shows us the importance of putting our faith in God. We receive righteousness as Christians from Jesus Christ due to his act upon the cross, but also based upon our response to what he did. And when we have faith, Christ's righteousness is given to us. Well, that's not a brand new concept. There in the Old Testament, Abraham was given righteousness because of his faith in God's promises. And here he is, this old man looking at the stars, having to believe that he's not going to just have a child. He's going to have descendants that are more than the stars of the sky. God tells him that. He believes it. Now that's incredible, incredible faith. God counts that belief as righteousness on Abraham's part. That simple belief. Is there a lesson for us? Yes, there is. Trust God. He always has a plan. All right, this covenant promise would not just be with Abraham, but with all of his future descendants. You see, God truly believes that God will accomplish what he has promised. Now, while all of this is true, Abraham and Sarah become impatient. And so Sarah decides that she's going to give this plan of God a nudge. She's going to help God out a little bit. She's going to sort of make a way for this plan to take place. And so she suggests that Abraham go into her Egyptian servant, Hagar, and have relations with her so that they can have a child, and then that child will be the fulfillment of that plan. And so they do that, and of course a child is born, and his name is Ishmael. All right? But God says to them, you know this child? He's going to be blessed, but he's not the son of promise. He's not the one that I promised to you. It makes me think that way too often I find myself helping God's plans along. When it seems like God isn't working at the right time, I sort of say, well, I'm just going to create my own plan. It becomes self-made rather than God-made. And that's what they did, but that wasn't the solution. No, God had a plan, and he is going to make it work at just the right time. So now Abraham is 85 and Sarah is 75, and they've got this son, and he grows up, so he's about 15, when all of a sudden, the son of promise to Abraham is finally born. And his name is Isaac. You know what Isaac means, the word? Laughter. That's because when the angels came and told Abraham that Sarah's going to have a child now, she was inside the tent, and she was eavesdropping, and she heard what the angels said, and probably, in the form of just human messengers, and she heard that, and she cracked up and started laughing. She's in the tent. She doesn't think they heard him, but God says, did you laugh? She says, no, I didn't, but you did laugh. Yes, you did. And so then God gave him this special child, and it was a child of blessing, one that always brought them laughter. They named him Laughter, Isaac. And Isaac is this long-awaited son through whom God promised he would bless the entire world for. Now you look at these two sons of Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac. And right here, we find that all of history has been shaped by these two particular sons. You see, Ishmael and Isaac are sort of the father of the terrible Jewish-Arab conflict that has gone on ever since. All the stuff that's happened in the Middle East between the Arabs and the Israelites all started way back here with these two boys some 4,000 years ago. Ishmael is recognized today as the father of the Arab nations through Abraham, while Isaac, of course, is the revered father of the children of Israel. And there's enormous conflict between these two half-brothers, just like there was between these two mothers. And that conflict that started there proceeds to this very day. What happened in a tent way back long ago affected all of history. So then we have to say, okay, well, which son really was the son of promise? Genesis 22:2 says, God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Now, there's a little note in the NIV translation that says this, as a study note in the study Bible. It says, in the Hebrew text, Isaac follows the clause, whom you love, in order to heighten the effect. Your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. So he's the son of promise. 2 Corinthians 3:1 identifies this area as Moriah. You know what is built on Moriah today? The Temple Mount that is owned by the Arabs. It's in these coming days, we're going to see a miracle where that changes. But how about Ishmael? Was he forgotten? And the answer is no, not at all. You see, he was still blessed. In Genesis chapter 17, verses 20 through 21, God says, and as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed you, and I will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. He will beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this set time next year. It's amazing to think of that. The lands of that Middle East and how it's all set up in accordance with what happened way back then. And then you compare it with the descendants of Isaac, the Middle East, right there in tiny Israel. Let's look at some of those next slides and see this. All right, so you see that whole area? That is all Arab land. Okay, hit that next slide. That little spot, that's Israel. So geographically, the children of Ishmael have possessed a far greater land and a far greater population than Israel. Israel looks like just the small part. Let's hit that next slide to just give you some more perspective. There's Israel, and there's the Arab world. Hit the next slide, please. One more picture. And let's go to the next one. Just to give you a picture, there's the state of California. That little sliver in there, that's the size of Israel. Isn't that amazing? Israel is so small, and yet it is so huge in world influence and world attention. And it's pivotal in the Old Testament, and we're going to say it's still pivotal in the New Testament, and in the book of Revelation it's going to be pivotal as well. So when it comes to size alone, there's a great disparity between Isaac and Israel. Why is this so? Well, Hal Lindsey, in his book, The Everlasting Hatred, The Roots of Jihad, says the Ishmaelites were given more land and ultimately more wealth than the Israelites. This was true in their past history, not to mention the vast oil wealth of modern times. And spiritual salvation has always been open to the Ishmaelites. And so there are many Arabs that have come to know Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. But God's covenant, which concerned his spiritual purposes, was only for Isaac and his descendants. And the physical blessings promised to Isaac were to facilitate God's spiritual call for the nation that would come from him. And so there in that land, you find the people of Israel and the plan of God taking place. So Abraham has two sons, I. What are their names? Isaac and Ishmael. But the son of promise was Isaac. He's the second father of promise. He is just this man that's got faith in God, just like his father Abraham did. But he is almost killed. Here it seems like God gives him this blessing, and all this blessing is going to be upon him. And so finally God says, yeah, now I'm giving you that son. And then God does something baffling. It's a story that, as I read it as a young Christian, I struggled with how can this be in the Bible? And we're going to look at that story on this video.
Now, in those days, it was a custom of those who trusted God to sacrifice an animal as an act of worship. This practice dated back to the children of Adam and Eve, who most likely had heard of the animal that was slain to cover their father and mother.
How would you make a burnt offering?
And so it was one day that Abraham and his son prepared to make an offering to God. Abraham's son was now grown
Go with your son.
and probably had done this many times before. But this time was unlike any other.
The day before, God had spoken to Abraham, telling him to take his son and offer him to God. Abraham was a man who obeyed God, but what was he thinking and feeling now? They had the wood and the knife, but where's the offering, his son asked. Abraham said, God will provide the lamb.
The Lord himself will provide the lamb.
And together they went to the appointed place. There they prepared the altar and arranged the wood. God had not yet provided another offering. So Abraham bound his son on the altar. Still, there was no other sacrifice. So Abraham lifted his knife to slay his son. Then there came from heaven a voice saying, "Do not lay a hand on the lad." And there in the thicket was a ram caught by its horns. And so it was that God provided an offering in place of Abraham's son. This was a picture of the offering that God would one day provide for the sin of humankind.
Boy, growing up, as I read that story, I just wrestled with it. How could God call a father to kill his own son? That's totally contradictory to everything in the Bible. And I just wrestled with that picture so very much. It's this book of Hebrews that helped me out a lot. And in chapter 11, verse 17, as Clinton already read, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac, your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, with which he also received him in a figurative sense. So here's the image. God tests Abraham's faith to the greatest dimension that can possibly be imagined, to not only kill his son, but basically to slay this promise that God had given him. This promise that he had believed in for all of these years. Why was he willing to go through that? Because he had enough faith in God to believe that God would either provide a sacrifice or a resurrection. That's before we even hear about resurrections, right? But he believed God enough that if God says to do it, he knew that God would either provide a substitute or he would provide a sacrifice. And then I think of Isaac lying there about to be killed, the terror that is in him, and watching as that knife comes on up and thinking his life is going to be over, questioning the love of his father and the love of his heavenly Father, trying to understand all of that. And then, of course, God provided that substitute. And that ram was given. And to both of them, it built their faith how God will always provide. God will provide the perfect remedy. And for us, that example back then harkens us all the way to the New Testament where Jesus Christ is upon that cross. And you wonder, is the Heavenly Father really going to allow his son, his only begotten son, just like Isaac is described, to be killed? And God the Father does allow that. And you can imagine the pain in the hearts of the Trinity as that takes place. But of course, God knew, as we would soon discover, that that son would be resurrected. And so what happened in the Old Testament is a type for what happened in the New Testament, and Jesus Christ arose from the dead. And Jesus Christ went on to finish this plan. It went on with Abraham and with Isaac. It's absolutely an amazing story. And so we see that Isaac had the same faith that his father did. Verse 20 of Hebrews 11 says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning the things to come. He too was a man of faith. And Isaac witnesses several major miracles in his life. He lives in the land of Abraham. He becomes prosperous. He dies in an old age after fathering 2 children. So as we follow this line, we got Abraham, and how many sons does he have? 2, Isaac and Ishmael. And Isaac has 2 sons. Janie, what are the names? Jacob and Esau. And so now we've got Jacob, and you've heard the story of how God took him, the number 2 son, and made him the son of promise. Jacob starts off being an incredible character, doesn't he? I think of myself how sometimes I'm such a rascal in life. I felt like a Jacob, and I think about how God can restore us and turn us into an Israel. And that's what happens. And so all these promises are passed through Abraham, then to Isaac, and then to Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons, and he has 1 daughter. And you've got all of those. But the key son through whom the promise would come would be Joseph. So you got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. That's the line of promise. In Hebrews 11 says, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped leaning on the staff on the top of his staff. And so it goes right on down through Joseph's lineage as well. And so let's look at that next slide if we can do that. Just follow along. We've got the pledge. We've got the promise, land, seed, and blessing. We've got Isaac and Ishmael. We've got Jacob and Esau. We've got the 12. And then, of course, we've got Joseph. Joseph, a great man of legendary character. I mean, there's few people in the Bible that basically all you see is the good about them. I can think of Joseph. I can think of Daniel. I can think of Jesus, of course. But so many of those men in the Old Testament, they had their bright spots, but they also really had their low spots. But this guy was just an amazing guy. And let's look at a little video about Joseph.
Joseph entered the land of Egypt as a slave. But in Egypt, God placed Joseph in the service of powerful people. And in time, Joseph was summoned to appear before the ruler of all Egypt, who was called the Pharaoh. Joseph was asked to interpret a dream. God gave Joseph the correct interpretation, concerning a great famine that would come upon the earth. The Pharaoh was pleased with Joseph, and so it was that he placed Joseph in authority over the land of Egypt.
To this man, bow to him!
Now, when the famine came over the earth, Joseph's family suffered greatly in the land of Canaan. But in Egypt, Joseph had filled the storehouses. And even though Joseph had been betrayed by his brothers, he still had a deep love for his family. Because of the position God had given Joseph, his entire family was permitted to come and live in Egypt, escaping starvation.
My son, my beloved son.
And so it was that a people through whom God promised to bless the nations came to dwell in a land that was not their own.
Yeah, that's a remarkable story. Joseph is sold into slavery. His brothers were going to kill him. They hated him that much. But instead, when they saw this Egyptian caravan came along, he said, well, let's sell him instead. And so they think that's going to be the very end of things. But then God brings about that change in Joseph's life where he goes from slavery all the way to being number 2 in the kingdom. And due to God's blessing Joseph, he blessed the land of Egypt as well. Even back then, we got blessing coming upon the rest of the world through this plan. And so he uses his administrative skills and his directions by God to create plenty in the land. And so up north, there's famine. So there's famine in the north, plenty in the south, and as a result, the people come on down. His family does. And they settle there. Now, after Jacob dies, the brothers wonder, what's going to happen now? They feel like they've only been kept alive by Joseph because of Jacob's presence. But now that he dies, what's going to happen? Is Joseph now going to have his retribution on them and what they did? And we read this passage in Genesis chapter 50, starting in 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. And his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what now is being done, the saving of many lives. That is such a critical sentence because what does it show us? God always has a plan. And we trust God, and that plan takes place. Joseph trusted God, and so he looked beyond all of his trials and all the evil done to him, and he recognized God had a plan. He trusted in God and in that plan, and as a result, he had peace of God. And so it goes on, it says, so then don't be afraid, I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. I find that Old Testament picture the best illustration possible of Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. God's got a plan. He did with them, he's got it with you. You're going through trials, you've had your own falls, God's got a plan. It's a redemptive plan. It's a restoring plan. God's got a plan. And so now they're in Egypt. They start multiplying. Oh, do they multiply? They're there for 30 years in prosperity while Joseph is alive, and then they slide into slavery for the next 400 years. But during that time, they reproduce like rabbits. I mean, it's just amazing. It's to such a degree that it becomes a threat to the Egyptians. And so they start becoming harder and harder on them and trying to limit the number of children they have and everything else. I think of what it was like for them there. Let's go to the next slide. And let's just see. The Israelites were probably there when all those pyramids were being built. And it could be Joseph had a part in some of those things. So it's amazing. They were at the center of the greatest technology taking place in their day. What an incredible thing. Next slide. And you can see those Israelites there while that stuff is being built and probably having a part in doing it. Let's go to the next slide, and let's just sort of keep clicking through those a little bit just so we get a picture of what was happening in Egypt during that time. Keep clicking there. All right. But through this whole thing, we see this. God had a plan. And so it looks like now they slid back into slavery, and now it's all over again. But next week we get to come back and say, no, that's not the case. Because God's going to send a great deliverer, and his name is Moses. And so we recognize this. God has a plan. You can trust in him. Now, just for some wrap up here. Number one, let's recognize that we too are the children of Abraham. Okay? John Piper says there are 5 things that we can learn from this. First, it's not the same as physical descent from Abraham. Even 20th century Gentiles can be Abraham's sons by faith. Number 2, it implies that being like Abraham, a chip off the old block, as it were, especially in his life of faith. Number 3, if you're a child of Abraham, you inherit the blessing of Abraham. You become the beneficiary of the promises that God made to his children. And that means, number 4, you are justified, acquitted by God of all your sin on the basis of Christ's death in your place. And finally, if you're Abraham's child, you have the Spirit who will lead you into eternal life. And then there's Jesus. Jesus Christ comes along to finish the plan. You know, when it says that God would give them seed, there's a passage that also says, and through that seed, singular, the whole world would be blessed. And that's talking about Jesus Christ. Now, if you know Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, then you are a child of Abraham, and all this blessing belongs to you. And this life that you live, you're going to have your ups and downs, but God still has a plan for you, and every time you respond in faith, you experience the greatest blessing that comes from that plan. So first of all, put your faith in Jesus Christ as your Savior, and then come along and trust him in your Christian experience, and trust him every day, knowing that God's going to take care of you. He's got a plan. So even though it seems like you've fallen and you can't get up, God's going to give you a way to get up. You know who you are? You're a son of Abraham. Remember the old song? Father Abraham has many sons. Many sons has Father Abraham. Well, guess what? You're one of them. Let's go ahead and play that song just right now. Can we do that?
Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, and I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. And Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, and I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord.
Big lesson, God's got a plan. Put your faith in him. Enjoy the plan. Enjoy the blessings. God's in control. Lean back. Relax. Worship team, close us up.